Hello and welcome to the third revision video in my series of revision videos on USA, A Nation of Contrast 1910 to 1929. Today we're going to be looking at key question 3, crime and corruption. So as always, I'm going to want you to get these headings down in some way, perhaps pause the video so that you can get them down. We're going to be looking at prohibition. There's only 3 headings for this one, but there's obviously a lot of information underneath these 3 headings. So we're going to be looking at prohibition, reasons for it, life under it, and the enforcement of it. We're going to be looking at organised crime, so the age of the gangsters, Al Capone and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And then we're going to be looking at government corruption, so Harding, the Ohio Gang, and the Teapot Drum scandal as well. So to start off, prohibition. Now, obviously, prohibition was the banning of alcohol in America between the years 1920 and 1933. And the reasons for this are quite varied. Now, the idea of prohibition, the idea of banning alcohol, had been gathering momentum since about 1906. 26 states had already restricted the sales of alcohol. So they hadn't banned it altogether, but they'd already restricted it. So it was an idea that had been there for quite a few years. The Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Temperance League were very powerful organisations, and they constantly strived to put prohibition at the top of the political agenda all the time. There's a lot of argument that there was links between drinking, wife beating and child abuse, that men would go to the pub and they would come back and they would beat their wives and beat their children. Henry Ford had spoken out saying that he thought that drinking reduced efficiency and output at work. Religious groups believed that alcohol was the root of all evil. And the Anti-Saloon League and Women's Temperance League argued that it would support and strengthen the traditional family values of the American family. It would encourage people to settle down. It would encourage people to demonstrate this strong family value that the supposed Americans had, and it was supposedly show and encourage immigrants to follow these values as well, to try and make them assimilate into American culture as well, which was a very common thing during this time. Also in World War I, many brewers were actually German, and so it was considered, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Temperance League jumped on this and really pushed the idea that it would be unpatriotic to drink beer, and it was even given the nickname the Kaiser's Brew. So, in September 1918, beer production was banned by Woodrow Wilson until the end of the war, and there was very little opposition to this. People didn't seem to be that bothered that he'd banned beer production. The Prohibition Amendment then was passed in January 1919, and this banned the manufacture, sale or transportation of intoxicating liquors and scheduled it to come in a year later. But what they didn't actually do was specify what intoxicating liquors were. So in 1920 then you have the Volstead Act, which defines intoxicating liquors as anything above 0.5% alcohol. So that's the Volstead Act in 1920. The Internal Revenue Service is then responsible for its enforcement as well. But actually it's a very, very big job, and as we will see later on, the IRS really struggle to police it. So these are the 4 things that we're going to look at with life under the Prohibition. So smuggling. It was very, very easy to smuggle during this time. And to get hold, it was really not very difficult to get hold of alcohol. Many people produced it illegally, and many have smuggled it from Europe, Mexico, Canada, the Caribbean. The USA's got more than 30,000 kilometres of coastline and land borders to guard, so it was impossible to police and impossible to prevent alcohol being smuggled into the country. And it was even possible to find doctors who would actually prescribe medicinal whiskey as well. So just actually thinking about that now, to go through some prohibition terms for you when I'm talking about them so you know what they are. So speakeasy is an illegal drinking saloon. A bootlegger is someone who produced or sold alcohol illegally. Bathtub gin is homebrewed gin. A still is a device for distilling alcohol. Moonshine is illegally distilled or smuggled alcohol. And rum runner is someone who illegally transports liquor across a border. Speakeasies then. Within a short time after the introduction of the Prohibition, there were more speakeasies than there had been legal saloons. So there's actually more illegal saloons than there had actually been before the Prohibition was brought in. In New York alone, there were 30,000 speakeasies by 1930. And an owner of a speakeasy had lots of different overheads, as well as purchasing illegal alcohol. They'd have to pay off the federal agents, senior police officers, city officials. They'd have to bribe a lot of people to make sure that their speakeasies could continue to function. And this situation was replicated across all the speakeasies in the USA. Health, it had mixed consequences for the health of Americans. Deaths from alcoholism had fallen by about 80% by 1921, but by 1926, 50,000 people had died from poison alcohol. The moonshine that was being created was very, very strong alcohol. Male deaths from cirrhosis of the liver fell from 29.5% per 100,000 in 1911 to 10.7% in 1929. But there was a massive increase in reports of blindness and paralysis. Again, this was a result of drinking poisoned alcohol. Drink driving did decrease, less people killed on the road, and accidents at work did diminish. However, people didn't really stop drinking alcohol or going during the Prohibition, and it had a mixed consequence on the health. Yes, there's less drink driving, less accidents because of that. Yes, there's less people dying of cirrhosis of the liver, but actually you've got a lot of people being affected by this poisoned alcohol, blindness, paralysis, because the alcohol is so strong. The brewing industry, it had a lasting effect on the brewing industry. St. Louis, for instance, had 22 breweries before Prohibition. Only 9 actually opened when the Prohibition came to an end. A couple of them diversified into soft drinks, developed a bottling industry, and some of them even manufactured car and lorry parts. In 1915, there's 1,345 breweries in the USA. In 1934, after the Prohibition had ended, there was only 756. So even after the Prohibition, it still had a real lasting effect on the brewing industry. So enforcing it proved very difficult, and the problem was it turned common people into criminals. So lots of people ignored it and carried on drinking anyway, but this basically then turned them into criminals because they were breaking the law. You weren't allowed, and it actually didn't ban. Another problem was that it didn't actually ban the drinking of alcohol, the consumption of alcohol. It banned buying it and selling it. So it was illegal to buy it and sell it. It wasn't actually illegal to drink it, and that was a problem as well. And the IRS never had more than 2,500 agents. And a lot of them were actually paid hands. The head of the IRS actually said towards the end that he would have needed 250,000 agents to actually get anywhere near policing it in the way that it was needed. Bribery was really common. As we've just said, a lot of the IRS officers were on the pay, police were on the pay, because the police were drinking as well. So anybody that wanted to drink, senior police officials, government officials as well, they were all on the pay because they hadn't actually stopped drinking. And it led to public corruption on a scale never seen before in the USA. It was that many public figures corrupted and bribed. It had never been seen before. By the late 1920s, there was lots of opposition because of the problems it had caused. One of the biggest problems it caused was the age of the gangster. Obviously, these illegal sellers, these illegal moonshiners, bootleggers, people owning the speakeasies, a lot of them were gangsters, and it kicked off this gangster culture. It really gave them a boost, and illegal activities became really dominant during this time. The 20s were a very, very dangerous time in the cities of America. And because of these problems, it was actually abolished in December 1933. There's a lot of anti-prohibition groups highlighting the problems, and as a result then, after 13 years, it was abolished, and that was the end of the Prohibition in America. So the Prohibition led to organised crime. There's a rapid growth in criminal gangs during the Prohibition, because it gives them the chance to broaden their involvement in activities such as bootlegging and make lots and lots and lots of money, because obviously this alcohol, because it was illegal, it was like black market, it was more expensive. Saw themselves as businessmen who, when faced with competition, cut down their rivals, usually violently, with things like the Thompson submachine, who was known as the Chicago piano or the Chicago typewriter. And they weren't just involved in selling illegal alcohol, they were involved in racketeering, which is basically immoral and criminal activities like prostitution, the illegal lottery, bribery, anything like that. That's racketeering, and that's what they were involved in. So one of the most famous gangsters of all, Al Capone, He's the son of Italian immigrants. He's expelled in 6th grade for striking a teacher, and he begins then basically to involve himself in minor criminal activity. He gets the nickname Scarface after insulting someone's girlfriend in a New York club where he was a bouncer. And he hated the name Scarface, actually, but it's a name that stuck with him for the rest of his life. He was working for Johnny Torrio, and this then led him to Chicago, where he rose through his ranks. And when Torrio retired, took over his endeavours, so took over his criminal empire. He controlled the mayor of Chicago, Big Bill Thompson. He controlled senior police. He fixed local elections. He bribed officials. Before long, he had half of Chicago in his pay. He controlled the speakeasies, the brothels, the racetrack, nightclubs and breweries, and he was making millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. He drove around in a bulletproof Cadillac for protection, and he actually had more than 200 of his rivals killed between 1925 and 1929, and he was never convicted of any of these. But he never actually killed them himself, but he ordered the killings of these people. So he always made sure that he had an alibi, that he was away, so that he was never actually convicted of any of these. He was seen as really glamorous by a lot of the people in Chicago. In sports games, people would see him and they'd scream and shout at him as if he was a celebrity. The TV cameras would pick him up, the radio would pick him up, and it would be reported on. He's sort of seen as a modern-day Robin Hood because he was one of the first to open soup kitchens to give clothes to the needy after the Wall Street crash. You can see a picture there of his soup kitchen, opened in 1930 after the Wall Street crash. And it was very, very difficult. There's a lot of people that actually liked having Al Capone in power because despite the fact that he was frightening and he was scary and he caused a lot of corruption and violence, he helped a lot of people. So there's instances of him owning laundries and laundering money through these laundries, ironically, or using them to sell illegal alcohol, and the owners being grateful to him because they were making lots and lots of money. They'd never had so much money before. So a lot of people actually liked him in Chicago, and he sort of, in an odd way, had Chicago organised, so to speak. He was known to have put Chicago on the map because he moved in really high social circles as well. And again, he was a bit of a celebrity, and he became quite popular. However, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre then, in February 14th, 1929, really put a dampener on things for him. So 7 of Bugs Moran's men, not Bugs Moran himself, who was the gang leader, he managed to escape, were gunned down in a garage by Capone's men, who had entered the building dressed as police officers. Capone was in Florida, which had given him the perfect alibi, but people had actually realised what had gone on. They realised the brutality of the gangster, and after this, his popularity began to decline. In 1931, then, he's prosecuted for tax evasion for about $200,000, and is found guilty and is imprisoned for 11 years. He's moved to Alcatraz, and is let go, and he died then a few years later, I think in the 40s of syphilis. So came to quite a bad end. Only had 11 years in prison though, and let's remember now he was responsible for the murder of around 200 people. Now, it wasn't just the criminals that were corrupt during this time, it was the government as well. So, President Harding and the Ohio Gang. So, Warren Harding had promised America that after the First World War, there would be a return to normalcy because of obviously the distress. And when he became president, he surrounded himself and his cabinet with friends and colleagues, many of whom were from Ohio, who were collectively given the nickname the Ohio Gang. However, some of Harding's friends used their position to line their pockets with money. The head of the Veterans Bureau, for instance, was fined and sent to jail for selling off veterans' hospital supplies for personal profit. Another one resigned in disgrace, and 2 more committed suicide rather than actually face public disgrace over a scandal. So, soon after Harding's death, Congress began investigating reports of corruption and bribery during his administration, and several members of the gang were charged and imprisoned for corruption. So he died in 1923, and after that was investigated. Charles R. Forbes, one of his ministers, found guilty of fraud, conspiracy and bribery. Albert B. Fall, 1927, who was Secretary of the Interior, found guilty and fined $100,000 and imprisoned for his part in the Teapot Dome scandal and the Elk Hills oil fund scandal, which we will look at in a sec. And Harry M. Daughtry, who'd been his Attorney General, the head of the justice system, was found guilty of selling alcohol illegally and given licenses and pardons to offenders. So all these men, you had President Warren Harding, Edwin Denby, Thomas Miller, Charles Forbes, Albert Fall, and Harry Daughtry. All of them resigned or committed some kind of fraud and were found guilty of it. They defrauded the government and taken money. They'd up to 200 million actually, and all of them found guilty. All of them evidence found against them. So the most famous of these scandals is the Teapot Dome scandal. Now it's a bribery incident that took place in the United States from 21 to 24 during the administration of President Harding. So Albert Fall, a member of the government, leased government oil fields to wealthy friends in exchange for hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes. These fields were supposed to be used for the US Navy only after 1920 to make sure that there would always be sufficient reserves in the time of a national emergency. Bearing in mind, this is 2 years after World War I. People are fearful that there's going to be another war. They wanted to make sure that they had enough reserves that if there was another war ever again, they would always be able to fight back. So doing this was quite it hurt the American defense system basically. Two oil companies acquired leases to drill, one in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and the other in Elk Hills, California, from Fall in secret. But he started actually spending lots and lots of money, and suspicions grew as to where his money had come from. Now, the men who had leased the oil reserves from Fall had given him $409 million in cash. Okay. These places were only supposed to be worth 100 million. So this man had made over $300 million, an obscene amount of money even back then, from leasing these fields illegally. Some of the details then leaked to the press in April 1922. Harding, the president, defends Fall, saying he's approved the leases. And the two oil companies claim national security demanded secrecy behind the deals. Okay, so the two oil companies said that, yeah, we had leased them, but it's the government that had demanded secrecy about them. That's why nobody's known about them. Harding then dies in 1923, and Calvin Coolidge comes into power. And leading oil companies start to complain that they've not been allowed to bid for the leases. So they find out that these other companies have managed to get leases for these oil fields that weren't supposed to be used, and they start kicking off. And then this leads to an investigation. So Senator Thomas Walsh, who's a Democrat, investigates. He's criticised by newspapers and Republicans, and he's harassed by the FBI by phone tapping, opening his mail, and anonymous threats. Okay, now this is because obviously it's the Republican government that are responsible for this. In 1927, the Senate finally ruled that the oil leases had been obtained corruptly and invalidated them. Navy takes control of Teapot Dome and Elk Hills, and Fall is found guilty of bribery in 1929. He's fined $100,000 and he's sentenced to 1 year in prison. He actually becomes the first ever US government official to be imprisoned. The heads of the oil companies, Sinclair, refused to cooperate and was charged with contempt. So Sinclair was the leader of one of the oil companies. And he actually gets a sentence for tampering with the jury. And the other head of the oil company that had leased them was acquitted in 1930 for attempting to bribe Fall. So he was acquitted. So the one head of the oil company who had leased them goes to prison, but only for tampering with the jury. And the other one is actually acquitted. But the minister himself, Albert Fall, goes to prison. Okay. And that is the end of key question 3. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next time with key question 4. Thank you very much.